Hello and welcome to The Search. I'm Shahei Jurgen. In this lesson, we're going to examine the 34th Psalm, and the title of our lesson will be drawn directly from the text of Psalm 34, Fear the Lord, you, His holy people. Of all the emotions experienced by humans, fear is one of the most powerful yet mysterious. The Irish poet Ciaran Carson captured the seriousness and silliness of anxiety and worry in his poem simply entitled Fear. I fear the vast dimensions of eternity. I fear the gap between the platform and the train. I fear the onset of a murderous campaign. I fear the palpitations caused by too much tea. I fear the drawn pistol of a rapparee. I fear the books will not survive the acid rain. I fear the ruler and the blackboard and the cane. I fear the Jabberwock, whatever it might be. I fear the bad decisions of a referee. I fear the only recourse is to plead insane. I fear the implications of a lawyer's fee. I fear the gremlins that have colonized my brain. I fear to read the small print of the guarantee. And what else do I fear? Let me begin again. Carson's poem speaks to the absurdity of fear, in that the same emotions of worry and distress can be caused by such grave matters as death and the onset of dementia or insanity, yet also fear can be induced by trivial matters, like referees making poor calls in a football match. How can concern over the consumption of too much tea elicit the same fear response in a person as a bandit drawing a pistol? Fear is mysterious, because one never knows what might trigger it, and that which causes fear in one person may have little to no effect on another. Fear is also mysterious because people react to it in different ways. The famous fight or flight response to perceived threats is one example of how humans and animals respond to fear, but not everyone falls into that simple binary. Some people, rather than fighting or fleeing, simply freeze, paralyzed in the face of danger. Now, most of the time, people have no idea how they'll respond to a dangerous situation until it actually happens to them. In some ways, of course, fear is necessary. Fear is like a warning bell alerting humans to potential danger. However, at times, fear can cause people to do that which they otherwise would never dream of doing. In this way, it's similar to anger. It can cause people to act in a way out of fear that exemplifies some of the worst decisions a person could make, which inevitably have terrible consequences later in life. And such was certainly the case for young David. Now, David was likely a teenager when he killed Goliath and began to lead military campaigns against Israel's most fearsome enemy, the Philistines. However, the success of those victories soured King Saul, who became convinced that David's fame overshadowed his own. Saul set his heart against David and even tried to murder him with a spear in the king's house. David fled, and for the next several years, the young man from Bethlehem would live like a fugitive on the run from Saul. In the early days of his flight, David sought refuge in one of the most unlikely of places imaginable. We read in 1 Samuel 21, verses 10 through 15, that day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, "Isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence, and while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. Achish said to his servants, "Look at the man. He's insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house?" Desperation drove David to seek refuge deep within Philistine territory in the city of Gath. It's almost absurd to think that the Philistines, having been at the end of David's sword so many times, would have given him refuge. It's really hard to imagine what David was thinking. And one can see how he instantly regretted this choice, because when he was recognized as the slayer of tens of thousands, it says David took these words to heart and was very much afraid in verse 12. You know, one of the interesting features of narratives in the Bible is their moral ambiguity. Because of his fear, David decided to act insane so that he might give the impression to these hostile Philistines that he'd lost his mind and was no longer a threat to them. And guess what? It worked. However, does the fact that it worked mean it was right? Was it right for David to deceive this Philistine king? Of course, the same question could be asked of Abraham, who also lied on two separate occasions to different powerful rulers about his relationship with Sarah, his wife. Isaac, Abraham's son, would later do the same. So 3 times in the book of Genesis, patriarchs lied, yet there was no condemning word delivered from God. And actually, the patriarchs were able to enrich themselves or strengthen their positions in the land through these encounters. David will enjoy similar results. Eventually, he will ally himself with the Philistines of Gath. And when they march for war against Saul, David will offer to join them. Now, ultimately, they reject his offer for fear that he would turn against them on the battlefield, but still, the reader is left with this feeling of unease that David would volunteer to go out and kill his own countrymen. Regardless of the moral quandary presented by these incidents, one truth which can certainly be derived is this: fear drove Abraham, Isaac, and David to do that which they probably would never have even thought to do under normal circumstances. The superscript of Psalm 34 says of David, when he pretended to be insane before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he left. Abimelech is probably a title for a Philistine king, like Pharaoh for the Egyptians or Caesar for the Romans. And thus Psalm 34 is a reflection and testimony about David's experience with the Philistines. Just a few comments about the structure and genre of this psalm. Psalm 34 is an acrostic poem. We've talked about this structure within the Psalter in previous lessons. Since it's not really addressed to God, it's probably best to think of this psalm not as a prayer or even really a song of thanksgiving, though obviously thankfulness is going to be a dominant theme. Really, Psalm 34 is a testimony psalm, a psalm that's designed to give witness and instruct hearers concerning some things about God, and in particular, concerning God's intervening and rescuing power. So let's read the text now, Psalm 34, beginning in verse 1. I will extol Yahweh at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. I will glory in Yahweh. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify Yahweh with me. Let us exalt his name together. I sought Yahweh, and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. Those who look at him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. This poor man called, and Yahweh heard him. He saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of Yahweh encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. Taste and see that Yahweh is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Fear Yahweh, you his holy people, for those who fear him lack nothing. The lions may grow weak and hungry, but those who seek Yahweh lack no good thing. Come, my children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of Yahweh. Whoever of you loves life and desires to see many good days, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from telling lies. Turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of Yahweh are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry. But the face of Yahweh is against those who do evil, to blot out their name from the earth. The righteous cry out, and Yahweh hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles. Yahweh is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The righteous person may have many troubles, but Yahweh delivers him from them all. He protects all of his bones. Not one of them will be broken. Evil will slay the wicked. The foes of the righteous will be condemned. Yahweh will rescue his servants. No one who takes refuge in him will be condemned. Psalm 34 begins with this jubilant praise. David proclaims his own intention to continually bless and praise Yahweh, and he invites all others who are enduring affliction to join him and do the same. Now, why should the oppressed glorify God? Well, David answers this question through his own testimony concerning Yahweh's work in his life. David says that he was weak and afraid. Now, the interesting revelation of Psalm 34 is that David has come to interpret his deliverance from the Philistines as an act of God. He says in verse 4, Yahweh delivered me from all my fears. And again, we have to wrestle a little bit with the message of this text. Was God pleased with David's deception and he worked through his lies to save him? Or was God displeased with David's actions, yet in spite of that rescued him anyway because of his unfailing love and commitment to David? We simply are not told. Whatever the case may be, it is based on God's rescue of David that the king now invites others to trust in Yahweh's salvation. David says that even Yahweh's messenger, the angel of the Lord, can be dispatched to protect and deliver those who fear God. Now, we need to certainly emphasize the use of the word fear in Psalm 34. David continues to discuss fear when he says in verse 9, "Fear Yahweh, you his holy people, for those who fear him lack nothing." At the heart of fear is the unknown. Mothers fear for their children's well-being, not necessarily because there exists some certain threat, but because the world is filled with potential dangers. Now, a situation can be dangerous, yet not necessarily cause fear. The reason people flock to ride roller coasters is because they invoke the same kind of emotional response as fear does. Yet people have confidence that they're actually safe and there's real minimal danger in riding them. And so it becomes a thrilling kind of sensation. Now, we also need to make sure that we recognize the multiple ways the word fear can be used in Scripture, and in particular here in Psalm 34. When David sought shelter among the Philistines, he was afraid, and rightfully so. He had every reason to believe that these people both wanted him dead and had the capacity to kill him. However, when David instructs people to fear God, he doesn't want them to be overcome with dread like he was surrounded by the Philistines. While it's certainly true that God has the capacity to kill like those Philistines did, the major difference between God and the Philistines is that God has absolutely no desire to kill, and certainly not to kill those who belong to him. The reality is that Yahweh will actually do the exact opposite. Verse 10 says, "Those who fear and seek Yahweh lack no good thing." So it's rightly been observed by many Bible students that when God is the object of fear, a better English word to substitute for fear is the word reverence. As Craig writes, the fear or reverence of the Lord was the basis upon which wisdom built. For the awe and reverence implied by the word fear created within the individual the attitude within which the spiritual and moral life was to develop. Hence, the fear of the Lord was the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs 1:7. Those who feared the Lord had no lack, for their lives were rooted at the true center of existence, namely the reverence of the one who granted human life in the first place. Now, this middle section of Psalm 34 is quoted extensively by the Apostle Peter in his first letter. And Peter's use of Psalm 34 is quite interesting. When speaking about the growth of believers, Peter wrote in 1 Peter 2, verses 1 through 3, "Therefore, rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good." And that last line there in verse 3 is taken from Psalm 34:8. "Taste and see that Yahweh is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him." The idea of tasting and seeing is meant to encapsulate an experience. If you take a bite of a scoop of ice cream, you experience its deliciousness. David is inviting people to experience for themselves God's rescuing power. Through that experience, they would see God as David saw him. Peter puts this idea in the past tense. So David uses it as an invitation, but Peter acknowledges here that the Christians to whom his letter was written had already enjoyed the Lord's salvation, and now he calls on them to grow in it. Peter goes on in his letter to discuss persecution and trials, which is really the heart of 1 Peter. After admonishing Christians in general, and then more specifically slaves, wives, and husbands, he writes this in 1 Peter 3, beginning in verse 8. "Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing. Because of this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life," and here's our Psalm 34 text, "and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." Who is going to harm you if you're eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. Now, there are two scenarios to consider. The first, of course, is the context of Psalm 34, David's fear of the Philistines. The second is Peter's encouragement to Christians who are facing all kinds of trials. The two scenarios are tied together by the theme of fear, be it fear of death, of being ostracized from one's community, of being ridiculed, of being threatened, of being persecuted. Peter's response to the fears experienced by believers was to draw on David and the lessons that he learned through his own fearful encounter. So what does the scripture have to say about this? What do these righteous men, David and Peter, have to say about responding to fear? Well, I think we can simply summarize their message in just a few words. They tell us to shun evil, not to lie or deceive, to seek and pursue peace, and also, of course, don't forget to pray. When evil is done against you, Peter says to repay it with a blessing. Schreiner explains like this: instead of insulting others or responding in kind, believers are called on to bless others. By blessing, Peter means that believers are to ask God to show his favor and grace upon those who have conferred injury upon them. Now, does this mean that believers are helpless against those who would do evil to them? No, neither David nor Peter believe that. Because as David wrote in the very next section of Psalm 34, verse 19, the righteous person may have many troubles, but Yahweh delivers him from them all. The similarities between the message of Psalm 34 and the teachings of Jesus and the apostles is striking. I think many often inappropriately characterize the Old Testament as promoting a kind of violent barbarism. But Psalm 34 reflects really the very heart of the Sermon on the Mount. It acknowledges that believers will suffer and face many trials, and that will be a fearful experience. But Psalm 34 also encourages those who are oppressed not to react in kind against their oppressors, but to do good and trust in God. Isn't that exactly what Jesus teaches in Matthew 5 and verse 10? Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Trusting in God doesn't mean that the pains of life will simply disappear. Psalm 34 doesn't say that. Rather, as Wilson puts it, blessing comes precisely from acknowledging one's dependence on God, that He alone is the refuge the psalmist seeks. The heart of many psalms can be found in the middle, sometimes at the end, but Psalm 34 really reveals its depths right at the start. When David says, I will extol Yahweh at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. I will glory in Yahweh. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify Yahweh with me. Let us exalt His name together. That is what David learned during all those years when he had allowed fear to dictate his actions. It took him a long time to learn a valuable lesson that now he is seeking to teach anyone who will listen. Come and listen to my testimony. Listen to my words. He says, if believers will simply taste and see, as he has, that Yahweh is good, they too, like David, will be able to love life and see many good days, days that are dedicated to praising and glorifying the God of rescue. And that is the heart of Psalm 34 and the testimony of David's life. Thank you for being here for this study of Psalm 34. Come back and join us next time as we continue to work our way through the Psalter. God bless.